So today we're going to be discussing Ashkdans, which ostensibly were containers for the tears collected by women whose husbands were away at war. And we're going to talk about the form, the manufacture, and the actual function of these objects, as well as how they came to be here in the collection at the Shangri Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design in Honolulu, Hawaii. We have two examples here, both of which date from the Qajar period in Iran. That era lasted between 1779 and 1924, and we estimate that these vessels were both made in the mid to late 19th century. Both of these objects were purchased by Doris Duke at auction, and they were purchased in New York at Sotheby's Park Burnett in 1956. So these are very distinctive shapes. They're often called swan neck bottles, and I think it's probably quite obvious to you as to why. This really graceful curve makes them some of the most delightfully constructed glass vessels of the Islamic world. The aperture at the top is distinctively tear-shaped and comes to a point. And this is actually constructed from hot working. So it's made when the glass is still molten and still fluid. So it's rapidly done by hand. And then the neck is extended. And then the rest of this, the body is made in a dip mold. So it's actually the glob of glass is put into the dip mold and then inflated, right? And you can see some of the remnants here. You'll see some of these beautiful striations, which are remnants of the dip mold in which this was fabricated. And then the final step is to fold over the base. So you have multiple techniques happening in this glass object, which tells us a lot about the incredible skill of the maker who is fashioning these vessels. And you can see, although these are different objects in different sizes and colors, that the construction method is very similar in both cases. So the colors of these are also quite distinctive. They're commonly found in this cobalt blue color, clear, and then slightly more rare is this really striking teal blue color. And this is done by adding certain mineral pigments to the glass when it's in a flux state, when it's fluid. This is done by adding cobalt, and this is done by adding copper, actually, to get this turquoise. So what actually is the function of an Ashkdan? I think it's quite lovely, this idea of collecting tears. It's really very romantic. And it certainly folds into a much longer tradition of these kinds of objects, right? And they're called lacrimatories, which just literally means tear collectors, from the Latin lacrima for tear. And we certainly have a lot of things described as lacrimatories in Greek and Roman tombs, for example, tiny little bottles, usually glass or clay, terracotta, right? And they've often been called tear collectors, mostly because of the circumstances of being found in tombs. But we actually know that far from being tear collectors, they were actually the holders of unguents, very highly perfumed, rare, ointments and waxes and things like that used to anoint the body of the dead and continuously reapplied, right? So even if those tiny little bottles from a different and separate tradition are not tear containers, I think it's quite obvious that it would be very difficult for this to be a tear collector. One, if you look at the size of it, it's obviously not going to be a repository for tears unless it's a whole community of people. And the other thing is just practically, if you take a look and spend time looking at this aperture, it's clearly meant to have things poured out of it, not to have things put in it. It would be almost impossible to have this up against your eye and collect tears. So. And another thing, in terms of not just observing the practicality of the construction of these objects, but it's also just carefully looking at some contemporary images. We have an object in our collection from the same period of time, from the Qajar era, a ceramic fireplace surround. You'll see that right here. And you can see this is an outdoor scene of merrymaking. People are playing music, they're dancing, there's lots of lovely fruits and foods in this wonderful outdoor picnic. It's clearly a very joyful scene. And right there, among this picnic, we have pictorial representations of Ashdans. So clearly they're not collecting tears in this scene. So what are they there for? And what Ashdans are actually for is pouring liquids out. And most commonly, these would have had a scented liquid, rose water being one of the most common. And you pour it out into the cupped hands or onto the feet of honored guests. It can also be used to pour out sherbets, which in the Qajar tradition were actually liquids to drink, not the frozen treat that we appreciate the American, the English version of the word sherbet. So this is actually a vessel to pour something out of, and it's very much a display kind of object. You can see that the function of this is secondary to the form. You can pour out rose water from almost any container. It can be a simple cup or a jar, and the same with sherbet. But something like this, something very fine, something very beautifully made, something so display worthy, tells us that the act of performing the pouring is incredibly important, and that people are noticing that act is happening. These are some of the favorite objects that we find here at Shangri-La. People tend to have a really visceral reaction to them, and happily we've been able to share them. This particular Ashkdan traveled to Hong Kong 2 years ago. Both of them have been on display at the Honolulu Museum of Art, and now happily they're also on display to the public here at Shangri-La. So I hope this has stoked your interest in Islamic glass of the Qajars, and also unpacking the function of an object vis-a-vis the form and the manufacture. So thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you to more videos about the collection here at Shangri-La.